Riane Eisler, JD, PhD, is a systems scientist, futurist, attorney, and macro historian whose work has transformed the lives of women and men worldwide. She is president of the Center of Partnership Systems, editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies at the University of Minnesota, and author of the book entitled Nurturing Our Humanity: How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, co-authored with anthropologist Douglas Fry, Oxford University Press, 2019. This book shows how the social and biological sciences, specifically neurosciences, support the findings from her research. Her other books include The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, Sacred Pleasure, Tomorrow's Children, The Power of Partnership, and The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, hailed by Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu as a, quote, a template for the better world we have been so urgently seeking. Eisler authored over 500 articles for outlets such as the Christian Science Monitor, the International Journal of Women's Studies, Business Insider, Quartz, the Human Rights Quarterly, and others. She keynotes conferences internationally and consults for governments on the partnership model, pioneered the expansion of human rights to include women and children, and received many awards for her work for human rights, peace, and environment, and the foundations for a sustainable and better future.
Welcome to the Collective Trauma Summit. My name is Thomas Hübl, and I'm the convener of the summit. And I have the big privilege to sit here with Riane Eisler today. Riane, so much warm welcome to you, and thank you very much to spend the time with me and with us here today to explore the depth of our collective development. So a very warm welcome, Riane, here.
Well, thank you.
So first of all, like you as a system scientist and as somebody who spent decades exploring life, our neuroscience, a multidisciplinary approach to life. So you have such a rich background, and I have so many interesting topics that I would like to talk with you about. But to get everything into this time that we have together, maybe we will start with just a little bit of background about how your maybe also personal journey informed or put you on track of your professional journey. And because I think many of us, have key experiences or have key elements in our background, in our biography, that also become our expression and purpose in the world. And so I would love to hear a little bit from you around that, and then we dive deeper into systems thinking together.
I think that's a very good way to start, because in terms of this being a summit on trauma, my work really is deeply rooted in trauma, my own childhood traumas as a child refugee with my parents from Nazi Austria, where I was born. And I witnessed as a young child on Crystal Night, a gang of Nazis, Gestapo men, broke into our home, dragged my father off. So I saw and experienced cruelty and destructiveness and insensitivity. But that night I also saw something that I today call spiritual courage. And it was my mother who displayed that courage because she recognized one of the Nazis as a young Austrian who had been an errand boy for the family business, and she got furious. I mean, how dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? I want him back. Now, as you probably know, since you are Austrian, also born in Vienna like I, there were many Jewish people killed that night. and my mother could very well have been killed. But by a miracle, she wasn't. By a miracle, she obtained my father's release. And by a miracle, we were able to escape. And my parents were able, money passed hands always. I mean, this is one of the things that really saved us. But it didn't always save people. I mean, my whole extended family was killed, and some of them were very well-to-do. Mm-hmm. But it was really, they were able to purchase an entry permit to Cuba. And so I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where, of course, I experienced and observed another injustice, another trauma, really, because poverty is traumatic. You know, the terrible gaps between haves and have-nots at that time in Cuba. And all of this led me to the questions, actually, formed in a child's mind. Does it have to be this way? Does there have to be so much cruelty, so much insensitivity, so much destructiveness, when, as I saw in my mother, we humans have such an enormous capacity for consciousness, for sensitivity, for caring, for creativity, really. And these really, many years later, of course, were the questions that my research, my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, historical, because I'm a systems person, I look at the whole picture, sought to answer. And the answer was a resounding yes, there is an alternative. But in order for us to build it, for us to even see it, we really have to, we have to think differently.
Oh, that's amazing. And just one more short question about you personally. So when I sit with you, like, you radiate a lot of warmth and positivity and light and real curiosity and you know, this spirit of exploration to me. So you transmit that from the first moment I saw you. And I'm wondering, what do you feel in yourself? Because trauma can be, like, also often experienced as a burden, a shutting down of our motivation, shutting down of our relational capacities. You know, it's like, or we find ways to transform it and then make it our gift in the world. And it seems to me that you took the second route. And can you speak a little bit to what in you gave you the strength to keep going? I mean, there must be some resources that help you with you know, your life story, also to transform some of your legacy into gifts that you share with us throughout your life.
Well, Thomas, I'm glad you asked that, because I really, for the first part of my life, I've always been an outsider. And I was an outsider as a Jewish. Suddenly, you know, from one day to the next, my parents and I became hunted with license to kill. In Cuba, I was an outsider. So I will say that as I look back now, that has helped me, actually, being an outsider, because it made it possible for me to look beyond the givens, you know, including all the many years of so-called higher education, which I now realize indoctrinated me to really fit into the old system. But I spent many years very confused. And really, I think to some extent, I'm still shut down. I have a very difficult time with negative images that come up. And I know what the origin is, of course. It's no mystery. But, and this is really, I think, it is because I am so passionate about this work, and because I felt it was my calling at a certain point in my life, that I have been able to transcend it. And, it is an existential commitment. I mean, people ask me, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I said, I don't happen to have a crystal ball. I mean, all I know is that I'm going to do everything I can in order to help us move in a more sustainable, more equitable, more caring direction.
Yeah, I can feel that when you speak. It lands in me deeply, and it also touches me too when you speak about your calling, and it's beautiful what you said is that you only know what you can do. We don't know where it's going, and we are not doing it even because it's going somewhere, but we are doing it because we feel called to do it.
That's right.
And it's beautiful, not just because of outcome driven, but because we are passionate about it. Yes. And I can feel that you radiate that when you speak. So that's very beautiful. And
well, my research, if I may interrupt you for a moment,
yeah.
also has shown me, as it has many, many people worldwide, women, men, young people, old people, that it's possible to build a better world. That the story that we have been told is false. That's, exploitation and violence and oppression of others, that's just human nature. That is a lie. And my work, my books, The Chalice and the Blade was the first one, all the way to my latest one, which I think you want to focus on, Nurturing Our Humanity, because it draws so heavily from neuroscience, simply show the evidence. The evidence is there, and that's very important.
So then illuminate us a little bit, how your work shows us that we can build, because it's right. So many people might say, look into the world, look what's happening now in Afghanistan, look what's happening, they're here in the Middle East and in other places, and look what's happening with racism or with climate change. So many people also nowadays feel that there is this kind of mountain of burdens that we face. And there's a lot of violence, and that's the human nature. So how do we build a different world? And what are the aspects, the mechanisms, the tools, the internal processes you uncovered? Maybe you can speak a little bit for all of us listening to you now. What's your finding?
Well, I think it begins with changing consciousness. I think you've read Nurturing Our Humanity. I have a chapter in it called Expanding or Constricting Consciousness. Mm-hmm. And our consciousness has been constricted. Look at what we're taught when we're children, the caveman cartoon, right? Everybody knows it. We show it to children before their brains, much less their critical faculties, are fully formed. And what is it? In one hand, he has a weapon, a club, and with the other hand, he's dragging a woman by the hair. So what's the message? Injustice, violence, male dominance. That's just human nature. That's how it's always been. And by implication, how it always will be. The evidence from archaeology, from anthropology, from linguistics, from even DNA studies now, shows that, to begin with, for most of the development of our species, most of our cultural history as hominids and then humans, we lived as foragers. And the evidence from all of these disciplines, I had been working on nurturing our humanity for 7 years when I invited the anthropologist Douglas Fry to be my co-author, because he is probably one of the leading authorities in the world on foraging societies, has written extensively about this, and he calls them the original partnership societies rather than domination societies, which is a language that I have introduced, by the way, and I can go back into that. So we know that we're told that war is just human nature, and you read these essays by academics, and that's their premise, you know? Well, it turns out that warfare is at the most 5,000 to 10,000 years old. I mean, that's a drop in the evolutionary bucket. So knowing that we have the capacity to build more societies orienting more to the partnership rather than the domination configuration is a first step. And also understanding what then are the elements of these two systems. That's part of changing our consciousness. Action follows, and action has followed. If you look at the last 300 or so years, when the Industrial Revolution went into high gear, if you look at the progressive social movements during that period, you see that they have all challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. I mean, think about the Enlightenment, the so-called rights of man movement, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their, quote, subjects. The feminist movement challenged another tradition of domination, the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over women and children in the so-called castles of their homes. It's very, very interesting. I mean, if you look at the abolitionist movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement today, what are they challenging? Another tradition of domination, the so-called divinely ordained right of a, quote, superior race to rule over inferior ones, all the way to the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, which at our level of technological development and overpopulation is about to do us in. So we have moved, but we've moved in bits and pieces rather than understanding that there is a configuration that repeats itself. And it can be either a domination configuration or a partnership configuration. And it can be either right or left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. So we really have to think outside the box, if you will. I know it's become a sort of a cliche, but I mean really think outside the box of our conventional social categories, which linguistic psychologists have long told us channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible to other alternative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's amazing, because like also in my work, I speak a lot about the fact that we have been born into a world that is already pre-traumatized, and it was going on for thousands of years. So we don't see anymore the systemic effects of trauma at first because they became so normal. Like our cultures have conditioned us that certain separation, like lack of collaboration, domination, and many of the things you said like are given as if that's normal.
Yes.
And how to liberate ourselves. That's a very powerful what you said. And so just maybe one question around domination. So what are the internal effects, like when we grow up in a society of domination? What are the effects on our neurology or neurophysiology, what our bodies, our societies? Can you speak a little bit to that? And then how, like a society more based on partnership, collaboration, exchange, open collective intelligence, what do we see?
Well, what we see, of course, is what we see all around us. The manifestations of trauma. I have spoken about trauma quite a bit, and I have made the statement that domination systems are trauma factories. Mm-hmm. It starts, of course, early on, and that is really one of the findings from neuroscience that, because we have focused only on specific families in studying neuroscience. Nurturing Our Humanity, and the subtitle is How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, takes it to where we have to look, which is the social, economic, cultural level. So what happens to a child in a rigid domination family, if that is the ideal norm in the culture? I mean, fortunately, and I really want to emphasize this, there have always, despite, in rigid domination systems, to even question, St. Augustine wrote in the Middle Ages that for anyone to really question their status in life, it's like a nose wanting to be an eye, totally against the laws of nature and of God and I don't know what. Well, we saw that changed, didn't we? Mm-hmm. And that was only because of some movement toward partnership. But when you ask me what happens, it depends. One thing that happens to children that tends to happen, because the good news is, I'll go even deeper and take a little sidebar for a moment. One thing that neuroscience shows is that given half a chance, okay, and that is a big, big if, our brains the pleasure centers in our brains light up more when we share and care than when we win and dominate. So there have always been people somehow that have not treated their children in the way that is required now by domination systems, whether they're religious or secular, whether it was Hitler's Germany or Khomeini's Iran or the Taliban or ISIS. Notice they've always, even Stalin, when he came into power, it was a regression to the so-called traditional family with him. And what is that family? It is an authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. So that is one of the cornerstones we have to pay a lot of attention to. And thank goodness there is a movement. Sweden was the first country, not coincidentally, by the way, because it is a country that has moved more towards the partnership side, although there's been a lot of regression in the last decade or so. But it was the first country to say that it is against the law to use physical discipline against children. Fortunately, the American Psychological Association finally I mean, it's kind of ridiculous, came to the conclusion that spanking, which is still approved by the majority of people worldwide, that spanking is not only ineffective, you get, quote, bad children if you spank children. Because, I mean, the human spirit does not like to be hit. I mean, you go to jail if you, I mean, the whole thing is nonsensical, because if it's against the law to hit an adult, why wouldn't it be against the law to hit a small, dependent child? Right? But what do children learn? They learn that violence is acceptable, even moral. And they also learn denial, because they're dependent on these adults who cause them pain. And these same adults tell them, though, that it's their fault, or it's the fault of some outgroup, whether it's a Jew or whether it's a Black person or whether it's a Shia or a Sunni in the Middle East. It doesn't really matter. There are only two alternatives. You either dominate or you're dominated. There is no partnership alternative. And former President Trump said that, he from his life experiences, it's all about domination, he said.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's so profound, and it's also, in a way, as you said, it's also ridiculous that something that's so natural and so obvious, must be stated in certain ways, must be scientifically researched in order to get a valid, to become a valid opinion in society. But that's how it is. I mean, I completely agree. So on the one hand, because you focus like on 4 foundational areas, and childhood is one of them. So, and you spoke to childhood a little bit. Is there anything else that why you see this childhood, gender, economics, and narratives and story as foundational?
Well, they're all interconnected is something that I really want to emphasize. What children, for example, if you move to gender, which we're taught in our so-called education system, is just a women's issue, a marginalized issue. I mean, think about it for a moment now, about our conventional social categories, because I really want to take us back to them. If you, for one thing, want to know how to build a more equitable, sustainable, caring society, none of them tell us how to do it, because if you look, there have been repressive, oppressive, violent societies in every one: right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. So, but the other thing is, and it's really fascinating, these categories, like most conventional studies of society, either marginalize or ignore no less than the majority of humanity, women and children. Now, we know from systems science, well, just common sense, that if you only look at part of a picture, you cannot connect the dots, you cannot see the configuration of the picture. And so what do children learn in this, quote, traditional family, this authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family? They learn to equate difference. I mean, think about it. Difference, beginning with the difference in form between female and male, which is a fundamental difference in human beings, right? We're a dimorphic species. They learn to equate difference with either superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. So it is not accidentally that whether it was for Khomeini, whether it was for Stalin, his wife committed suicide, because he was so mean, really, in his domination. Whether it's the Taliban, whether it's the rightist fundamentalist alliance, in other words, right, left, capitalist, socialist, everything, a top priority is always either maintaining or imposing this, quote, traditional family. Now, not everyone, the people who saved Jews, for example, the Ollinger studies, were very interesting. When you ask these people, why did you do this? You knew that you were not only risking your own life, but your entire genetic pool, so to speak, your family. You were all going to be killed if discovered. And they said, but we had to do it. Mm-hmm. And it turned out that these people came, when you really dug down, from more partnership-oriented families. Not perfect. I'm sure there were quarrels and there were, humiliations and disputes, but there was sort of a basic respect. Because we talk about, we've learned to think children must respect their parents. Well, we're talking about fear, not respect, aren't we? Right. In a domination family.
Right.
This respect has to go both ways.
Right.
So what happens then? And this is related to the childhood thing, to the authority figure telling you that it's the outgroup's fault. You learn to apply this template for difference to a different race, to a different religion, to a different religious sect, like Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia, right? So it's a mess, but it's all connected, and it's connected neurologically. So we spend a lifetime, those of us who have a glimmer of consciousness, trying to heal, when in reality, we are set up for just having to heal ourselves. Now, it's beginning to change in a very meaningful way, but look at Afghanistan, look at the rightist fundamentalist alliance. In Nurturing Our Humanity, I mentioned some of the so-called parenting guides, which simply say you have to teach children that the parent's word is law. So you scald them with hot tea, you slap them. 18-month-old babies sitting in a high chair who don't really understand, but they do understand one thing. You either comply or else. There would be a lot of pain.
It's even like just you talking about it, it's painful. Like, just sharing it and feeling it, because it's like that's a reality right now happening as we're sitting here.
Yes.
Is very painful.
Well, it is painful, but let's look at it another way. It is important that we deconstruct, but also reconstruct. So many, I remember when The Chalice and the Blade first came out, I got a letter from a young high school student, and she said, I go to this very progressive school, and we're constantly protesting against war, against racism, against pollution, against whatever, right? And she said, when I read your book, I realized that what we're protesting against is the domination system, which really produces all of this. And so it is very important. I cannot emphasize enough the importance, and we're moving to one of the cornerstones now, language and story. Think of our language, the categories available to us for gender, matriarchy or patriarchy. So what does it tell us? Either father's rule or mother's rule. There is no partnership alternative. Words matter. Language matters. But it's very difficult for people to get out of their comfort zone, especially with the barrage of literature and media and the canon in the university. I cite a book by the historian of science called David Noble, who wrote a book called The World Without Women. We have to think a little about the history of modern science as he did. He points out that 600-700 years ago, when so-called modern Western science emerged, it emerged out of a clerical, celibate, pretty misogynist world, a world without women, and I would add a world without children. And it's not only that women are inferior, but you have these very rigid gender stereotypes, don't you? In domination systems, where real men are not like women. I mean, that's the cardinal rule. So it's the ranking of so-called masculinity, toughness, violence, domination, over so-called femininity, caring, caregiving, nonviolence. And that is something I deal at length with in my book on economics, in all of my books, but we have had a hidden system of gendered values. I mean, think about it. There's always enough money for prisons. Well, what's that? It's the punitive male head of household, isn't it? Or for weapons and wars, that's the hero as warrior, as killer. But somehow there hasn't been enough money for caring for children, for caring for people's health, for keeping a clean and healthy home environment, which translates into, of course, a planetary environment too. Caring is just women's work, and it is devalued. Now, we're seeing movement away from that. Look at the policies that President Biden is proposing. But the resistance is horrendous, isn't it?
How do you see, because in the whole chain of dominance from one generation to the next, every generation goes, or many people in the generations go through like a traumatization. Some of us go through strong traumatization. So we are living in this chain of passed on and often reinforced traumatization. So when we now want to deconstruct it or heal it and transform it into what I also deeply believe in, into a much more relational and partnership society and fluidity of collective intelligence and collaboration. So what do you suggest are steps that we can transform that on a collective level? Because you mentioned just a few, but basically it's kind of a global phenomenon. So how do you see us transitioning into that partnership society or partnership culture, given the amount of traumatization, and that we cannot just mentally jump from domination to partnership, but how do we transform the recurrent aspect of trauma that sits deeply in our bodies, in our behaviors, as you said, in our language patterns, in our thinking, in the way we interact with each other, the incapability often of relating and feeling each other. So can you maybe speak a little bit to the transition?
Well, I think we are in a struggle for our future between those who want to push us back, really, to more rigid domination times, and also those who want to maintain the domination elements of present systems, and those of us who want something more, something better. I want to say that everything changes once your consciousness changes and you understand the configurations of partnership systems and domination systems. For example, it isn't that partnership systems are completely flat. There are hierarchies. Every society needs parents, needs teachers, needs managers, needs leaders. But I make, again, new words that help us think differently. I make a distinction between hierarchies of domination. We all know those, right? It's you do what I say or else. And what I call hierarchies of actualization, where responsibility, accountability, we hear a lot about transparency. That's movement towards the partnership side. Benefit don't just flow from the bottom up, but both ways. And power, my first book reporting my findings was called The Chalice and the Blade. Mm-hmm. And it's redefining power, isn't it? The blade is a symbol of power in domination systems. And you see it very clearly in the changes in the art. I won't go into that. By the way, Chalice just was translated into Spanish in a new edition in Spain, and it created a virtual media storm there, interviewed by all the major papers, El País, etc. Because what it showed, even that book, which is now as relevant as ever, and it is about 33 years old, almost 35 years old, actually, came out in 87. I chose that title as symbols of power in either domination or partnership systems. The blade is the power to dominate, to destroy, to kill, to take life. The chalice is also very powerful. And it is the power to give life, to nurture life, to illuminate life. And we're right back to gender, because what Chalice shows is that the power to give life incarnate in woman's body was actually what was represented by the so-called Venus figurines, which archaeologists couldn't see as anything except some kind of weird form of pornography. Because they were, but they were big-breasted, big-bellied, pregnant, probably, very clearly etched vulva. The power to give and nurture life was venerated. So we're talking about changing values, but we really have to change our economic system. And if we don't change what is rewarded, if we keep rewarding domination, then people will be traumatized. Domination economics, whether it's capitalist or socialist, create artificial scarcity. Not only by misdistribution to those on top of resources and investment, siphoning off of resources into weapons and wars, ever more expensive, but by also not investing in caring for children. The so-called women's work that men, actually both men and women, get endorphins, rewards of pleasure for doing. So when you ask me why these four cornerstones are emphasized by me, they're ignored in the conventional conversation, but they are foundational. And if we don't shift them from domination to partnership, which is happening in bits and pieces in every area, and if we don't then connect the dots and understand that we're talking about something that has been behind the curtain, so to speak. Mm-hmm. If we first open the curtain, then we can really be much more effective in our action. Everybody needs to continue to do whatever they're doing, like to really talk about trauma as a social phenomenon. That is so important. We keep talking about healing ourselves, and trying to heal yourself in a partnership, in a domination system, it's like trying to go up on a down elevator. You really have to change the system. That doesn't mean that we don't apply partnership principles of mutual respect, mutual accountability, mutual benefit in our relationships, regardless of what our position is. But we all really also have to be social and economic activists.
Right. And I also feel that we are transitioning also into a time where social healing or collective healing or forming containers like to harvest also the power that bigger we spaces. And I have seen this many times, like the healing power of large groups or groups for every individual within it, but also for the system can unfold. And I think there's lots to learn how we use those tools, and maybe how some other wisdom traditions, did that already over thousands of years already. And but before we go to that, I would love to refer to, you said something about economics now. Maybe you can help illuminate a little bit. Okay, how can we go from an often domination-based, power-based, investor power-based, money power-based economy system to a different form of economy? So how can we practically do the transition for many people who are listening right now? If I feel yes, I feel that intuitively, I feel that that's right. How do we change the system? What are our options there? Where can we make the steps towards a change?
I think that the first step is to really look at what are the values driving both capitalist and socialist theory. And theory is not some abstraction. I mean, theory is like a roadmap, And unfortunately, while both capitalism, Smith, and socialism, Marx, challenged certain elements of domination systems, they maintained and perpetuated the devaluation of the work of care. I mean, for both, there is nothing in either the capitalist or socialist theory about caring for our natural environment, what I call the natural infrastructure. I mean, present economic systems, as I point out in The Real Wealth of Nations, ignore the three life-sustaining sectors: the household economy, the natural economy, and the community volunteer economy, on which everything is based, and do not reward that work. So for both Marx and Smith, caring for children in households, caring for people's health in households, keeping a clean and healthy home environment was supposed to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. So gender is writ large in changing the stereotypes of what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a man is a big social issue and a big economic issue, because we have had systems that simply do not reward the so-called women's work and keep men from doing it. Even though, as I said, men as well as women get neurochemical rewards of pleasure, endorphins, by the grace of evolution when we care for another, whether it's for a child, a pet even. We feel good, right? I mean, it's really, we have to stand reality right side up. So I always start with a clear understanding of the four cornerstones and of the two alternatives, and that we're not talking about a utopia. I write about pragmatopia, a possible place. That's the first step. And to recognize that actually the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement and the environmental movement and the movement for social and economic justice, they're not unrelated. They're all part of the movement towards the partnership side of the partnership domination scale. Mm-hmm. And once we are clear, then we can really keep doing whatever we're doing to build a better world and to heal ourselves from the traumas. Mm-hmm. But we can actually begin the reconstruction, because if you look at the progressive social movements that I just mentioned earlier, they have been very, very important. You know, in the European Middle Ages, I sometimes joke about it. I say when I get really depressed, I think of the European Middle Ages, because they look a lot like the Taliban, right? Mm-hmm. You know, women had no rights, children had no rights. No human rights was, the Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings. I mean, it was pure, really. I mean, there were partnership elements, of course, but the dominant element was domination. And we have moved, but they all failed to focus on these cornerstones. Mm-hmm. So that is really my advice, is let's not buy into the notion that childhood and gender are just women's or children's issues. They are central social issues. Story and language. We live by stories and by language, and we've been told false stories. One thing we can all do: change the conversation. Stop arguing about capitalism versus socialism. Talk instead about a caring economics of partnerism. We can all make a difference by changing the conversation. Now, we have to also change the reward system. And we're beginning to see with President Biden in the United States, but also in Costa Rica, for example, they united the healthcare, the medical system with the public health system. And they now have a lot longer lifespan than the United States. Mm. It works. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the World Happiness Reports, every year they come out. For the fourth year in a row, Finland was number one. I wrote an op-ed for Ms. Magazine, which said, want to be happy? Elect women. Because as the status of women rises, men will also vote for so-called feminine soft policies. They have universal child care. They have very generous paid parental leave. They have universal health care. And guess what? They have a very healthy market economy. Mm.
Yeah, you're speaking to very fundamental principles that I think intuitively, or when we are connected to our bodies, when we are connected to what we feel and sense, like make a lot of sense. And often when we are disconnected from our sensing, feeling, or also from our emotions and our capacity to bond and relate, so then we override those. But I think many things that you say, that when it just resonates inside, and it's so clear that that the importance of what you're speaking to. And I wanted to ask you also, when you, for example, you spoke about some of the changes of President Biden, when you look at current US society with structural violence, racism, how do you see like our social transformation, given the big gaps and splits and trauma fields that we see? Let's just focus in, there are many others around the world too, but let's focus on the US for a moment. How do you see us working this constructively? How can we make a difference? And also when people now listening to us, like many people here want to or are already making a difference. So what is your take how to transform a society of violence and racism and also structural violence and inequity into a different society?
Well, first of all, when 70 plus million people voted for Donald Trump, we know that we have a very traumatized population that is correspondingly in denial. So denial, as I said very early in our conversation, is built into domination systems as mediated largely by families, but also by economics, religion, politics, etc. So the denial of climate change, the denial of election results, the denial of COVID-19, they're all part of trauma, aren't they? So let's stop talking about, studies show something very interesting, that there are two sets of studies that have been ignored. One of them is in Nurturing Our Humanity. The other one came out later, so it isn't. One thing that Trump voters had in common was that they had a horror of women who are assertive. Because that violated the basic principle of the ranking of equating difference, with domination or being dominated, okay? Mm-hmm. And so the other study is also fascinating. When asked about child rearing, these people tended to really value not creativity and curiosity and, the things that characterize us really as humans, but compliance, obedience, respect in the sense of fear. So childhood and the work that's being done now on changing child rearing is vital. Mm-hmm. And we're seeing already that in the youth, while there are those who are really shaped by domination systems, more and more young people are more open, aren't they? More open to change. Mm-hmm. I think that we're talking about short-range change in the sense that we have to change the reward system. We have to reward care work, caring for people, caring for children in particular, because poverty is traumatizing and it's built into domination. We're not talking about capitalism, we're talking about domination economics, whether it was a Chinese empire or an Arab sheikdom or a Indian pasha or feudalism. What is trickle-down economics? It's the same as feudalism, isn't it? That those at the bottom are supposed to content themselves with the scraps dropping from the opulent tables of those on top. So let's really call it what it is. Mm-hmm. And I think that I believe in human creativity. Mm-hmm. Just about everything, including our cultures, are human creations. Mm-hmm. So once we understand what the intervention points are, what the foundations are, because what I started to say is if you look at the modern progressive social movements, most of their energy and their resources has gone into dismantling the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. And we really need to pay attention to the foundations on which it keeps rebuilding itself. Whether it's as the Taliban or the rightist fundamentalist alliance or Trumpism or whatever.
Yes, and when you look at, like, when we transition for a moment to healing. So when we, I mean, you maybe in your own personal journey, or how can we, or what are elements or tools that really help us to heal those internalized structures? You know, when the domination structure, when I went through a childhood of domination or violence or being beaten or obedience, and I didn't have like parents that taught me through, you know, relationality and through competence-based hierarchies instead of power-based hierarchies, so that I could really learn and resonate with. So how can I work those inner structures? Because many of us feel an impulse that many things that you're saying, you know, resonate deeply, and we feel that that's true, and still we carry our own reactivity, we carry the own symptoms of our own traumatization inside. Do you have at least some tools for, or some ways how we can address those in ourselves to transform also the legacy of that
Yes.
domination?
Well, I wrote a book called The Power of Partnership, which actually was given an award as the best self-help book of that year. But it's very different from most self-help books. For one thing, it uses the partnership domination scale. But for another, it starts with how we relate to ourselves, and then our intimate and, you know, family, etc. relations, then our work and community relations. But then it shows how all of this is related to our national relations, to our international relations, to our relations to nature, and yes, to our spiritual relations. Mm-hmm. I recently wrote a piece for Cosmos magazine on really something that progressive religious leaders, I so want them to do. And maybe I think that would be such a healing tool for so many people. It talks about separating the grain from the chaff. Because at the core of, as you mentioned, of all the wisdom traditions, of all the religions, is this partnership core of caring, of nonviolence, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But then there is this domination overlay that happened in the course of history. And until we separate it in our scriptures and provide it for people so they can see why would you have the idea that giving birth is dirty and a priest has to purify a woman. It's in the Bible, after she gives birth. When in the old belief system, we have figurines giving birth as part of the sacred art. Life-giving is sacred. Pleasure is sacred. I think that there's so much that we can each, but I really want to say that for those of us who grew up with severe trauma, and that's really most of us, I think we just have to accept that that's how it was, that it wasn't our parents' fault. You know, in many cases, we blame the parent, but they're just doing what they were taught was the thing to do, and that it's up to us to change these approaches. And once we become, I can only speak from my own experience, which is once we become agents of cultural transformation from domination to partnership, it lifts part of it, not all of it. And we certainly don't want to hold ourselves to standards of perfection. You know, the perfect is the enemy of the good, and we're all going to have trigger points, and we're going to, you know, I mean, but I think that doing our very best, and yes, elevating care. I mean, if we had, just think of what the world would be like if our economic system as goals for our economic system and as rewards for our economic system was caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. That is a caring economics of partnerism. And it goes way beyond capitalism or socialism. I mean, the former Soviet Union was a domination system, and it was socialist. I mean, we really have to take off the blinders and see what really has been done to us, and then become part of the change. And I think that really is a very healing thing.
Yeah, very much so. And you're emphasizing very strongly the relational component, and that healing is something that we do together, and that we resource each other in the healing process, and how intelligent is when the relational flow gets strengthened. And so that's very beautiful. And Riane, I see the time, and
Yes.
maybe if there are any final conclusions that you want to leave our listeners with. I mean, you mentioned many important aspects of your work, and I think our work already. Yes. So, but if there's anything else that you think you didn't mention, or you want us still to consider as afterthoughts after this conversation finishes, please.
Well, I think that the books that I mentioned, I mean, all my books are really applying this to different. I mean, I wrote a book called Sacred Pleasure, which is a heresy, right? But it looks at both sexuality and spirituality, and I really highly recommend it. But the book that I mentioned, aside from Nurturing Our Humanity, which has all the hard so-called evidence from neuroscience, I do recommend The Power of Partnership, and it has very practical suggestions after each chapter. It has a tool that my wonderful husband and I use called Taking a Session, and that really does help. It has, I mean, but the beginning is always what did I learn? And why was I taught this? And then from there, we can just expand.
It's so lovely to sit with you in this space. And like you really transmit the journey of your life, and the positivity and curiosity, but also the rigor to explore deeply with the scientific rigor of formulating all of that through research, but in a loving way. And it's a very beautiful composition. So I thank you very much for our conversation.
Thank you.
And you add a lot to the summit through your rich, multidisciplinary exploration. And I think many of us can take a lot into our lives to consider, to apply, and become agents of that partnerism.
I want to give you two very, very simple things to do as a closing. One, go to our website, centerforpartnership.org. For example, there is a resource for child rearing called the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide. Very short, very simple, available in both English and Spanish, okay? The second thing is that I am teaching now at Meridian University, and there will be two things that I really invite. I invite all of the people who are part of this wonderful endeavor of yours, Thomas, to be agents of the shift from domination to partnership. And I will be teaching in a program that offers a PhD or a master for exactly what I'm talking about for partnership practitioners. And I can send you the URL for that, and maybe you can make it available to people. And I will actually be also teaching in a course that's open to the public, which I'll also send you. It's a 7-week course, very reasonably priced. But I think the beginning really is changing our consciousness, and then action follows.
Beautiful. So thank you very much, and I wish you a lot of success and blessing with your work and with the beauty that you enrich our world with. So thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, for everything that you're doing.
For more information, visit the website centerforpartnership.org and her website, RianeEisler.com. Riane has graciously offered our audience a free gift of the final chapter from the book, Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Lives, and Future, which is entitled A New Beginning.